tent on the edge of a Syrian desert village called Bahuz. Inside, a group of ISIS wives sit in a circle on the carpet, their children clutched against their chests. One of them locks the tent flaps from the inside. Another pours fuel across the canvas walls and the floor. And then, together, they strike the match. They burn themselves alive rather than walk out and be captured. The flames are still rising when Kurdish soldiers arrive. This was just the beginning. Because what happened to the wives of ISIS's top leaders after their husbands fell was darker than anything you have ever seen. Before we talk about how these women died, you need to understand what they did, because the world has a tendency to remember ISIS wives as victims, young girls tricked online, lonely widows, brides who didn't know what they were marrying into. Some of them were, but the women at the top of that pyramid, the wives of the actual leaders, were not victims. They were something much darker. Start with Asma Mohammed herself, the woman sitting in that Baghdad courtroom. While her husband Baghdadi was on television declaring his caliphate from a mosque in Mosul, Asma was running a private house in the same city. Inside that house, she kept kidnapped Yazidi women locked in rooms. The Yazidis are a small religious minority from northern Iraq. In August 2014, ISIS swept into their towns and killed thousands of the men in a single weekend. The women and girls were rounded up like cattle, sold in markets and handed out as gifts to ISIS fighters and their families. Asma personally held these women in her home. She watched them, handed them over to ISIS fighters who came to collect. The Iraqi court that sentenced her to death said she was directly involved in the genocide. Now there was another wife whose name almost no one knows. Her real name was Nisreen Assad Ibrahim. The world knew her as Sayyaf. Her husband Abu Sayyaf was Baghdadi's oil minister, the man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen petroleum revenue that financed the entire caliphate. Sayyaf was not just a wife. Inside that house in eastern Syria, she personally guarded a 26-year-old American aid worker named Kayla Mueller. Kayla had been kidnapped while leaving a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Aleppo. She had gone to Syria to help refugees. She was being kept in a small room in Sayyaf's house, and when Baghdadi himself visited the compound, Sayyaf opened the door of that small room and handed Kayla over to him. Baghdadi raped her repeatedly over a period of months while Sayyaf made sure she did not escape. Sayyaf later admitted under American interrogation that Baghdadi had owned Kayla. Kayla never made it home. She was killed in 2015 at the age of 26. Her mother said, in the only public statement the family ever made about it, Kayla did not marry this man. He took her to his room and abused her, and she came back crying. And these were just two women. Across Raqqa, the ISIS capital, the wives of commanders ran something called the Al-Qansa Brigade, an all-female police force. They patrolled the streets in black niqabs, carrying weapons. They laughed women for showing a sliver of skin at the wrist. They ordered the executions of girls who tried to flee the city. Locals were more afraid of these wives than of the male fighters, because the wives could enter homes and check on other women without restriction. They believed they were untouchable. Their husbands controlled the cities. The world was at their feet. Then in 2017, the world started taking those cities back, one door at a time. And the people behind those doors had not forgotten what these women had done. Mosul fell to Iraqi forces in July 2017 after 9 months of fighting. The city that had hosted Baghdadi's Caliphate declaration was reduced to rubble. And as the ISIS fighters retreated into the old city, their wives tried to slip away with the civilians. The problem was, the locals remembered. They remembered which woman in a black niqab had pointed at which neighbor as an informer. In a city where everyone had lost a brother or a son to ISIS firing squads, the wives could not hide. In Tikrit, north of Baghdad, a widow of an ISIS emir tried to blend into a crowd of refugees. A group of locals recognized her. They dragged her into the public square. These were people whose sons had been lined up against walls and shot by her husband's men. There was no trial. They picked up stones from the rubble around them. They stoned her to death in the square while the crowd shouted the names of the dead. In western Mosul, the widow of Abu Abdurrahman al-Balawi, one of the founding ISIS commanders, tried to disguise herself in plain clothing and walk out with the refugees fleeing the old city. She made it less than 100 meters. People recognized her instantly. She was beaten to death in the street with sticks and rebar. Nobody intervened. In Fallujah, video surfaced online of ISIS wives lined up against walls in their black robes. Local militias had set up makeshift courts in abandoned buildings. The trials lasted less than 10 minutes. There were no defense lawyers, no appeals. The judges asked one question: were you married to an ISIS fighter? If the answer was yes, the women were taken outside and shot by firing squad. In other neighborhoods, the rage was even less organized. Houses known to belong to ISIS families were set on fire, sometimes with the women still inside, sometimes after they had been dragged out and handed to local militias who carried out swift executions in alleyways. Human rights groups later admitted they could not even count the number of women killed in this period. They simply called it revenge without limits. And then there were the cellars. As Iraqi soldiers cleared the old city house by house, they began encountering something terrifying. ISIS wives, cornered with their children in basement rooms, had been given suicide vests by their dying husbands. When the soldiers kicked the door in, the wives detonated. They killed themselves. They killed the soldiers. They kept the other women and children sheltering in the same cellar. One Iraqi officer later said his unit lost more men to women in basements than to ISIS fighters on the streets. But not every captured wife ended her life in a Mosul cellar or a public square. A small number of them, the ones who had been married to the most powerful men in ISIS, ended up somewhere completely different. They ended up in a small white room with American interrogators. And what happened in those rooms would eventually kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself. May 15th, 2015, 2 years before Mosul falls, a Delta Force team helicopters into eastern Syria in the middle of the night and storms a compound belonging to Abu Sayyaf, ISIS's oil minister. Abu Sayyaf is killed in the firefight. His wife, Sayyaf, the same woman who had guarded Kayla Mueller in that house, is captured alive. The Delta operators put her on a helicopter. She is flown to Iraq, placed in a small, clean interrogation room, and then she does something nobody expected. She talks. She does not talk under torture. According to the interview she later gave The Guardian, the Americans were polite. They wore civilian clothes. They brought her tea. They placed maps in front of her, and Sayyaf, the woman who had handed an American hot.
1,000 years ago, the Muslim world ran the planet. Baghdad had libraries, while London had swamps. Cordoba had universities, while Paris... We'll start with the one that nobody wants to touch, because it's not about faith, it's about biology, and about a social system that chose to ignore biology for 1,000 years. In the Middle East and North Africa, only 19% of women participate in the labor force. Men, 71%. The global average for women is roughly 48. That's the World Bank's own data. Make up 43% of tertiary enrollment, a higher share than men. They're graduating, they're just not working. The World Bank estimates that closing the gender employment gap, girls are locked out of classrooms. This policy is now in its 5th year. Afghanistan is the only country on Earth. UNESCO projects the higher education ban alone will cost. Most Arab states spend about 0.5%. Now, a handful, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they'll scrape between 0.6 and 1.5.
One of the so-called ISIS brides charged with terrorism offences One of the so-called ISIS brides charged with terrorism offences is accused of attempting to indoctrinate her own children with radical views, as well as trying to recruit Australians. Details of the case against the Broadmeadows woman emerged as she fights for bail. Her lawyer telling a magistrate she does not support Islamic State.
Rayyan El-Houli spent 8 months living in Melbourne's northern suburbs. She lost her freedom 4 days ago amid serious allegations of being involved in terrorism. But now the mother of 4 wants her freedom back.
We can't make any comment beyond what we said in the court.
The 34-year-old is accused of supporting the killing of non-ISIS members and attempting to indoctrinate her own children with radical views. She's also been accused of attempting to recruit Australians to join her in Syria, where she travelled to in 2013. But her lawyer told the bail hearing the mother has different beliefs. She renounces ISIS and violent jihad. She wants nothing to do with it, not now, not in the future, not directly or indirectly. Chief Magistrate Lisa Hannon read from the prosecution's submissions, describing the evidence against Ms El-Houli as extremely concerning. She travelled to Syria for the purpose of joining ISIS and while there, held radicalised views and married a number of members. She repeatedly expressed views supporting the killings and serious injury of non-believers. She only left when the Caliphate was defeated and not as a result of a change in views. El-Houli was remanded in custody and she'll be psychologically assessed this week from prison. Her lawyer telling the court she is a highly traumatised individual and it's become a struggle to hold her life together. The bail application was adjourned. Ms El-Houli's legal team will seek advice about the risk she poses if she was released back into the community. Sophie Jacobson, 10 News.
It is an ethical, legal and political dilemma whether to block the return of so-called ISIS brides and their children from camps in Syria.
A group of 34 carrying brand new Australian passports are attempting to make their way home. Today, as politicians argued, we asked a fellow mother her view. Amanda Johnson has a unique perspective. Her son Ashley was killed by the very terror group these women joined.
No one, it seems, loves an ISIS bride. But few people have more reason to loathe them than Amanda Johnston.
I can't agree with anything that they stand for. People were being beheaded. It was horrific what was happening.
Her son Ashley, an army reservist, was so alarmed by the hateful violence of the so-called Caliphate, he volunteered with Kurdish forces to fight them. 11 years ago, almost to the day, he was killed in action in eastern Syria.
He was a hero before he went over there. For me, he felt that ISIS were the world's problem. So I think he just felt that he would like to do something to try and help.
ISIS lost all its territorial holdings in 2019, but its ideology still festers. Most recently, it is alleged, with the massacre at Bondi Beach. The Prime Minister says he has no sympathy for the 34 women and children now trying to return to Australia.
My mother would have said, if you make your bed, you lie in it.
The Australian government takes very seriously the risk that this cohort poses. We understand how serious this is. We are closely monitoring this along with our security agencies as well.
But the government will not prevent their return.
Of course, Australian law applies, and there are obligations that Australian officials have.
Not good enough, says the opposition.
These are people who actually have evil and hate in their heart. And so why you'd want to bring them back to Australia and think it's a good idea, I don't know.
The public mood is swinging behind the strongest possible restrictions.
Do I believe in bringing in the ISIS brides? No, I don't.
Pauline Hanson is riding high in the polls, in large part because of her position on who we let in.
Since the Bondi massacre, the people are frightened. The security in this country is a big issue for Australians. So yes, we do need to look at the people we're bringing in the country.
Last night on Sky, she raised her language to an extraordinary new level.
You say, oh, well, there's good Muslims out there. Well, I'm sorry. How can you tell me there are good Muslims?
The opposition won't try to outflank her with that language, but it says temporary exclusion orders created by the Morrison government should be used against the ISIS brides before it's too late. But they only last 2 years and can only be issued on ASIO advice or if the minister believes the returnee will commit a terrorist act or will train or support terrorists, and they can't be used on children under 14.
If this government isn't even willing to temporarily prevent these people from coming back to the country, then are they really interested in our national security?
Quite apart from the women who chose to sign up to the ISIS nightmare, what legal and moral rights exist for their children?
I mean, some of those children are going to be, in their teens. I think that they would need a lot of therapy.
What we may never know is whether the ISIS children pose more of a risk to Australia where they are or allowed into a country, Australia, they have never known.
We might say, well, it's not our problem if they remain there, but actually, because of the Australian connection, they're likely to be used by, well, at least potentially used by Islamic State and other groups to target Australia and target recruitment in Australia.